Thanks again, Lizzie, for agreeing to answer some of our questions. So we drafted 3 of them, and let's see how the discussion goes and whether I hope we have time to cover all of them, but maybe there will also be time for some more questions. And the first one was about REF, because we were asked to look at REF and also at Polish research evaluation system for the reasons of proximity of Poland to Ukrainian research environment and culture. And with REF, I guess we just liked the approach that it looks at excellence. So it would be great to hear your thoughts from your institutional perspective and responsible research assessment perspective. What could we take from REF, which you like and would advise?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because obviously we any research assessment is constrained by all sorts of external factors, and in your second question you start to talk about some of the constraints. So I've put, you said you were struggling to find some of the criteria, methodology, etc. used by the REF. Now I've put a couple of links in the chat to, obviously the 2021 REF has now gone, and we're looking towards 2029 now. Can you just check that you can actually access those? And if you can't access those links, I can send them through to you, because the REF is quite well kind of transparently documented, and the guidance is, great, you can. The guidance is long and complex, and on those websites you should also have access to, so there's the guidance on submissions, which goes to institutions describing what they need to do and when they need to do it by, and the kind of the overall shape of the REF and the underlying principles of the REF, which are and there's a lot of them, and then there's the panel criteria and working methods, which is almost the guidance for the assessors. So it's divided into, I think it was 36 units of assessment last time around, which are different discipline areas, and each has and they're all of those units are in 4 main panels. So that's broadly your arts, your engineering, your kind of sciences and so on, social sciences. And each of those units has a sub-panel, it has a chair, a deputy chair, and the panelists are appointed. And of course, the REF is kind of shaped across, well, REF 21 was outputs, impact, and environment. Outputs was 60%, impact was 25%, and environment was 15%. For the next REF, they're proposing to change those fairly significantly. Impact will stay at 25%. Environment is moving to people, culture and environment, and it's expanding from 15% to 25%, because that's trying to address some of these kind of broader systemic issues that we're facing in the research endeavour around, really people and standards, I suppose I would say research culture tends to cover. So are we providing environments in which researchers can thrive and develop healthy careers? Are we recognising all of the contributions to research? Are we working to high standards around ethics and open practices and so on? So they're kind of expanding the focus on that in recognition that this is a key systemic issue for us in the research environment. And if we don't address this, if we don't kind of care about that, then ultimately the long-term health of the sector will suffer. And as a result of that, the focus on outputs is reducing. And they're looking at expanding that term from output, so just looking at your kind of your journal articles and your sculptures and all the rest of it, to contributions to knowledge and understanding. So it's got to be, they're trying to recognise a broader range of contributions. Again, trying to address perhaps some of the systemic issues that, focus on the journal article might not be serving us particularly well. We need to be caring about data and software and other forms of submission. So that's how that's going. But obviously for REF 2021, it was those 3, outputs, impact and environment. It was, I think if you speak to folk on the ground, they would say that it's, it was highly intensive for both the submitters and the assessors, you know, because the output element was the largest, followed by, you know, impact and then environment, but it was all peer assessed essentially. Everything was red. There was no kind of reliance on indicators, and so that's obviously highly resource intensive. It's challenging for people to kind of collate and write all of those environment statements and impact case studies, and then it's intensive for those to assess. So moving, you know, thinking about your question too around the resource that you might have, you know, that would perhaps not work so well. There, you know, there's always questions around the balance of these elements. You know, is it right? You know, it's changed again for Ref 2029. There's a lot of pushback against that. There's a lot of concern about the complexity of changing rules, you know, so if you look at those websites I've sent you and you go on to frequently asked questions, you can see that every week more and more frequently asked questions were answered, and of course the answers to those questions then kind of formed part of the assessment. So it was complex, but you do find obviously, and I'll talk a little bit about the INOM scope framework, which was actually is being used to design the next ref and might be useful to you in thinking about how you design your approach. You know, these kind of, when it comes to designing an assessment, there's a cost benefit analysis that needs to be done, right? You know, what ultimately are you getting out of this analysis, and are the costs proportionate? And I think a lot of people on the ground in the UK would say that was perhaps out of balance last time around. I think perhaps I would say that. A lot of they were very, very keen to make it very fair. So they introduced a process, for example, for identifying where individual staff might have had negative circumstances that affected their production of outputs, and therefore individual staff were invited but not made to submit a statement to say, well, my production of outputs was affected by, you know, health factors, family factors, whatever. And then, you know, people like me had to read all of these harrowing statements and then decide based on the ref's guidance how many outputs therefore that those circumstances could entitle them to have a reduction of. So that didn't work well, and I think they recognise that. So they're trying to make it very fair, but obviously that makes it highly intensive. But you know, obviously the ref results in quite a significant amount of funding to the UK universities. The different devolved nations apply the ref outcomes in different ways to decide, therefore you got this in the ref and therefore you get this amount of funding. But that I can share that information with you as well. That's publicly available if that's of interest. So I think, you know, ultimately one of the questions for you is, you know, and I don't know the answer to this, you know, what impact is this a funding mechanism, or is this just an assessment mechanism? And if so, that will affect what you do. I'll pause there in case there's anything.
For us, it's linked to a funding instrument.
Okay.
That's how state budget will be divided among institutions.
Yeah. I mean, the benefit of peer review obviously is that it is perceived as fair, and it is researchers assessing researchers, you know, so it's not the government assessing, you know, so there is a perception broadly that this is kind of fair, but the impact on the individual researchers was quite significant and perceived to be negative. So there was a big it was called a real-time ref review, and again the outcomes of that are available if you want to have a look at those. And one of the findings of that review was that, you know, the ref was generally perceived to have a negative impact on researchers rather than a positive one. But you know, you're not going to please everybody all the time. Yeah. Can I answer any specific questions on that? Is that the sort of answer you were hoping for, or is there anything else that you'd like me to cover?
Yes, and please, Alexei.
Well, I was just wondering, so we had looked through some links which we could find about the methodology of REF, of course, and so my impression was we would maybe be more interested in, or specifically interested in something like manual for evaluators to see the instructions. So how do you manage that on the operational level? Because so as you mentioned, the procedure is perceived as fair by the community. So in our case, we have large problems with, we are a small country scientifically, and we have problems with making sure the procedure is fair when researchers evaluate other researchers, because they in turn know that they will be evaluated as well, and so on. So we would be interested to see how do you resolve possible conflicts of interest which occur at that level. So what do you do when you select evaluators? How specifically you instruct evaluators to assess this or that criteria, or which, let's say, levels of performance do you set, and what is so how we determine what is okay in this or that field of science, and so on. So something like those, I understand that those might be some internal documents of REF, but if you can share some insight, at least partly, in how do we deal with those problems, maybe that is something which we are very interested in.
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So so you're right that all that's publicly available to us is the panel criteria and working methods. So we can see how each unit is defining, so for outputs, for example, originality, significance and rigor, and for impact, significance and reach, and it does vary by unit. So you can kind of see that's publicly available. To get the inside track on exactly how those outputs were assessed and therefore calibrated, and the guidance that went to panels, you would that's not publicly available. And so people like me can pick things up from, so every university, so we had about 13 academics who sat on panels, and we got them together afterwards and said, what can you tell us about how this works? So we've got some insight, but that's not definitive, and every panel worked in a slightly different way. But there were, so in most panels, every output was read by 2 individuals, and there was calibration. Obviously, where an output is submitted, so some outputs would be submitted more than once to the same panel. So you can use that as a method of calibration. So are the 2 outputs being assessed in the same way? And some outputs are submitted more than once to different panels, obviously because of the way that methodology works. So then that's another kind of mechanism of calibration. So every panel did have its own kind of mechanisms for doing that, but they're not published. From our panelists, outputs were, so you will know that we have there's a 4-star rating. So 4-star is world leading in terms of originality, significance and rigor. 3 stars, internationally excellent. 2-star is internationally recognized, and 1-star is nationally recognized. And then 0 was unclassified. But actually, most panels assessed on a 13-point scale. And that's how we are now at Loughborough kind of assessing our outputs internally. And I can share what we're using based on the panelists' feedback, which is, so for each of those, so is it strongly 4-star, solidly 4-star, definitely 4-star, very, very likely to be 4-star, possibly 4-star, but maybe 3, and so on for each of those. And then there was a kind of calibration exercise within each of the panels to kind of work it out. But how they actually assessed those outputs and came to those scores in the first place, I think there's a lot of psychology there, because at the end of the day, we're human beings and we're subject to all sorts of biases, even if we are trained and told, this is the criteria, you mustn't use journal impact factors, all that stuff's still in the head. And if you really aren't sure on output, and bear in mind, panels were fairly small relative to the huge range of subdisciplines that were on which outputs were submitted. So, you know, some outputs will be assessed by an expert and others won't be. They will not be assessed by an expert. They'll be an expert in their own field, but they won't be an expert in the discipline. And that's some of the pushback that you get from academics saying, well, there's nobody on that panel who works in my space. So how can they possibly make a judgment on my output? You know, but they do. And so some of that's opaque really to me, and I can't really give you more than that. But I mean, you could try and speak to some of the panel chairs, but obviously there's a lot of panels, there's 36, and they will all treat it slightly differently. So I'm sorry, that's all I can offer you on that.
Thank you. Alexander, please.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to so you can confirm or just comment on this. So this like illustration from the last ref, right? Probably you recognize this picture very well, right, Liz? Yeah, and here is also this model which you have just described with stars, right? And my question is that let's say that's a impressive number of research outputs which was assessed, right? And this gives us around 2.5 research outputs per academic staff member, right? So do we understand this right if all these research outputs were assessed by peer review?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And all impact case studies, which gives us roughly like, let's say 11 or 12 impacts, 11 or 12 researchers per one impact, also were all assessed, of course, by peer review, right?
Yes.
All right. Thanks for confirming this. Another question. Did you use, okay, do you plan to still use, in any case, some bibliometric indicators? Of course, you will not use probably journal impact factor, right? Not, right? Okay.
Absolutely not. No.
Yes, we already know that, but do you plan somehow, whatever, use like Ash index or something like this? No.
No, there's a very, very, very strong feeling about this in the UK. To be funded by Research England, all English institutions have to, as part of their terms and conditions, sign up to statements of responsible metrics. And obviously the H index and the journal impact factor are overused and obviously cause all sorts of problems that you're familiar with. And the guidance is very explicit that outputs will not be assessed by journal metrics. However, those journal metrics are in the heads of the assessors, as I say, and when it comes to assessing outputs, if they are really unclear, I think it is likely that that those metrics will be kind of subliminally influencing their decision about an output. You know, if it's published in that journal, then can it really be 2-star, you know, or if it's borderline 3-star, 4-star, but it's published in a particular journal, it might be more likely to become 4-star. And we can see that, I think, through, so after the ref, a piece of work was done to consider whether artificial intelligence could be used to assess, to reproduce the outcomes of the ref. Have you seen that report?
Harnessing the metric tide, right?
No. So that was, the metric tide was 2014. So after the 2021 ref, colleagues at University of Wolverhampton did an assessment as to, so they had all the output scores from the ref, which no one else has access to, and they tried to reproduce those output scores using artificial intelligence methods, so using bibliometrics essentially. And I can share that report with you, it's publicly available. And they found that, you know, in some disciplines, you could replicate the output scores using bibliometrics. And the journal impact factor was one of the most, that had one of the highest correlations with the output scores in some of those disciplines, suggesting that, you know, even though you're not explicitly assessing outputs on journal impact factors, because in some fields you know, that because researchers are putting their best work in those journals, so there's nothing inherently good about the journal, because the researchers are putting their best work in those journals are then kind of reflecting on the scores of those outputs. But they've decided that we're not going to use artificial intelligence in REF 2029 in any serious way, although I think they'll continue to kind of assess how this might be legitimately used. For kind of ethical reasons, essentially, you know, that if we state that we're going to use it, then everyone's going to be starting to put all their work in those journals, and that's not going to help us as a sector. And obviously, in some disciplines, the correlation was much lower, but that was quite an interesting finding, I think. And I think that for folks like that might have less resource to throw at this sort of exercise, it might be helpful to you. And obviously the Italian system, they do use more bibliometrics at the kind of STEM end of their assessment. So, but not at the kind of arts and humanities end of the assessment. So there's a possibility of using bibliometrics, you know, at some high level of granularity, I think. So if you're looking at, you know, if you're looking at, it's easier to replicate outcomes at university submission level. So I can, the correlation at, you know, Loughborough's submission to chemistry versus Imperial's submission to chemistry can be replicated quite well. When it comes down to that output is a 4-star and that output is a 3-star, the correlation is less strong, as you would expect. But when you're looking at these larger aggregations of data, particularly in the STEM fields, there is an argument that bibliometrics can be helpful and instructive. But I suppose there's always this, you know, bigger systemic issue that if you're using these indicators in that way, what's going to happen ultimately to the sector and to the cost of open science? You've got your open science plan, you know, so there's the bigger questions to think about there, but it's something to explore, particularly now we are seeing. So did you see that the CWTS Leiden ranking is now using OpenAlex data? Yeah, so that's
they announced today.
Yeah, announced today. So that's, you know, that and there, it is reporting that there aren't, you know, it's not perfect, this data, but it's pretty good. And in some cases, the reports are coming out that the OpenAlex data is actually better than Web of Science and Scopus data, because it's community source, because it's openly available, people can correct it and so on and so forth. So so there's opportunities there, I think, to look at this. And the CWTS Leiden colleagues would be really good people to speak to, as would the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative in Australia, because they're very that they're using that data for their own rankings as well. Thanks, Irina. Yeah. So, you know, it's more inclusive. I mean, OpenAlex data covers thousands and thousands more outputs than Scopus and Web of Science.
Thanks, Lizzie. Actually, several more questions. Try to be like not that complex, but still. So you mentioned you will be assessing wider range of research outputs, and you mentioned research data and research software, right? Could you please just quickly comment on what else? What are the other most important things when we are speaking about wider range of research outputs?
I mean, so software, data, and translations are the three that often come up when we're talking about broadening the range of outputs. The irony is, you know, in the UK, it was always possible to submit any output for assessment. So you could submit software and data and translations last time around. There was, and even review papers, but I think there was anxiety about submitting them because there was a lack of confidence as to whether they would be fairly assessed relative to outputs. So just, sorry, coming back to the bibliometrics point, I should say that although bibliometrics weren't used to assess outputs in 11 of the units of assessment, so that's about a third, bibliometrics were supplied to those panels to support their decision making. So the outputs were not assessed by bibliometrics, but they were supplied. So every output was supplied with the number of citations and whether that appeared in the top 1%, 5%, 10%, 25% of outputs in that journal category, essentially. And they used Web of Science data last time around. So bibliometrics were involved in that way. It wasn't in some panels, but it wasn't, they weren't making the decision. So in terms of, yeah, a greater range of outputs, the reason I mention that is that, you know, if you know that you're submitting to a panel like physics, where they are using citation data, and you have a chance to submit an article which you know appears in the top 5% most cited in its field, or a data set which has no accompanying citation data, which one are you going to submit? Well, obviously the journal article, because you know that's got a much stronger chance of being assessed as a 4-star output. So I'm hoping that this time around, if they want to broaden the range of outputs that that folks submit, that they will not be using citation data at all, because it's just going to put people off submitting a broader range of outputs. So I think, yes. So as I say, anything can be submitted, and if you look at the guidance on submissions, you can see the sorts of categories. You have to say it's a sculpture, it's a so you can see the sorts of you know, outputs that could be submitted. I don't imagine that will expand really for this time around. They're just hoping that we will get more
my network or lasers.
Looks we have lost Elizabeth.
Hello, sorry, what?
Yeah,
You lost me.
We lost you.
Sorry. Where did I get? I looked up and you were all completely frozen, and I thought, oh no, I've bored them to death.
Mesmerized.
Okay.
Where did I get to? Sorry, where did I disappear? That's a hard question, isn't it?
It's a hard question because
I was talking about a broader range of outputs, wasn't
broadening
I?
of the outputs.
Yeah, and maybe if you could repeat everything you said after that, because I think that was what was the last that we could hear.
Okay, I'll try and keep an eye. I'm looking out the window for inspiration, and then but I need to look in your faces to make sure that I've not lost you. What was I saying? So I was basically saying that, you know, software data sets, translations are some of the kind of other commonly cited categories of output that we'd like to encourage more of. In REF 2021, you could already submit those things and a wide range of other types of output. You can see the types of output, the output categories on the guidance links that you can access. So I think it's not that we're that more different output types are submittable this time around that weren't submittable last time. It's just that they're hoping that more people will actually submit them this time, because I think I talked about, you know, the difference in you know, if citation data is being supplied, then it's a bit dangerous to submit a data set when you could submit a journal article.
And just last question in this category very quickly. So we mentioned that REF is moving towards also assessing this environment, right?
Yes.
And it will gain more points, let's say, right, this time. So from 15% to 25%, which is quite impressive, quite important.
Yeah.
Could you just a little bit elaborate on that? So what are the main categories which would be assessed in this environment thing?
Yeah, so they're moving from environment to people, culture and environment. And the short answer to that question is we don't know yet, because the way it's going to be assessed this time round is through some kind of structured questionnaire and data, and some kind of data. We don't know yet what data and indicators are going to be used for assessing people, culture and environment. That piece of work has been allocated to a separate project being run by Technopolis and an organisation called Crack Vitae, which are a research development organisation. There's a lot of national bodies involved, so the Disability Staff Network and the Association of Research Managers and Administrators, and they will all be co-designing a set of indicators that could be used for assessing, Alexander, Nathan, both great, co-designing a set of indicators that could be used to support the assessment of people, culture and environment. That's going to be reporting, alongside the development of the indicators, they're going to be piloted. So there's going to be a pilot exercise with a small number of institutions for a small number of panels, and they're going to assess those institutions on those indicators to see how well it works. So it's all up for grabs, really. But some of the things that have been mooted as possible indicators are things like proportion of staff dedicated to research and development. I'm trying to think. My mind's gone blank. I'll dig some out for you as sorts of examples. But in the Harnessing the Metric Tide reports that myself and James Wilsden and Stephen Curry wrote, we made some other suggestions in there as to what could be assessed in that space. But it's, you know, the way that it's being proposed is that there will be some core indicators, so markers that you have to hit that threshold in order to even be assessed by the ref. So you have to reach a certain standard. Then there'll be another core set of indicators on which all institutions will be assessed, so they're relevant to everyone. And then beyond that, there'll be a what they're calling a, what's the term they're using? I can't remember the term, sorry, my mind's blank this morning, but basically a wider menu of indicators that you can select if it's relevant to you as an institution, because research culture and environment is a huge space, right? And if you are a small institute of arts and humanities, it might be less relevant to, some indicators be less relevant to you than if you're a large, multidisciplinary established institution. And every institution has its own research culture challenges that they're looking to address. So that's broadly how they're seeking to address it. And I'll just, whilst I'm on the call, dig out the data on that.
That's also what we've been discussing, that we will probably have some kind of threshold, and then there will be additional points. There will be like a menu of indicators, and institutions will be able to select which ones would suit them best, and they could get extra points for that. Okay. We were also wondering how team science could be evaluated, because one of the emphasis that we're making, that we, of course, there are research stars, and an institution might have 2 of them and score highly, but we want to encourage a real research culture in institution and collaborative work. And if there are any indicators or any approaches, how that could be measured or rewarded, or I don't know what's even the right word for that.
It's interesting, this stuff, isn't it? And I think this is where I would probably point you to the INORM scope framework, because are you familiar with this? Not expecting you to be.
Sorry, I am, but I'm not sure about other colleagues. Maybe can we talk about it, sir?
So the scope. Can I share my screen and just show you?
Yes.
Would that be okay? Okay, so I'll just put the link for this, the scope framework into the chat. So the scope framework for responsible research evaluation was used by the REF, is being used by the REF to kind of redesign REF 2029. It's also underpinning our work specifically on research culture indicators. And it's basically a 5-stage process. I kind of made reference to this earlier, but for evaluating responsibly. So if you're starting with a blank sheet of paper for designing an assessment, it kind of helps you think perhaps a little bit more systematically about how you might achieve a responsible and meaningful evaluation. So the 5 stages, very briefly, are firstly to start with what you actually value about the thing that you're evaluating. And it sounds like that's something that you're working on very much in Ukraine. So what is it that we actually value? And things like team science and open research are kind of really important things that we care about, and it's great to actually think deeply about that. With things like, but with those sorts of things, I suppose there's 2 things. There's one, is it team science or open science ultimately that we care about, or is it what open science and team science and research culture leads to? Is it so? I think that's something that you just have to explore a little bit, because obviously when it comes, if you're just assessing team science, when it comes to our probe stage of scope, which I'll come to in a second, you might find that there'll be some unintended consequences if you're just focusing or too heavily weighting that sort of thing. So S is kind of starting with what you value about the thing you're evaluating, and specifically here to not start with what other people value, and which we so often do in evaluations, and not start with the data that we have available to us. So it's very easy to think, well, we've got bibliometric data, it's global, it's so easy to manipulate, we've got all these tools, let's start there with our evaluation. But actually, is it citations that you care about, or is it other aspects of your research that you care about? The C of scope is kind of to consider the actual context in which you're evaluating, because we often have these conversations around, oh, the journal impact factor, it's bad, isn't it? Or the H-index, that's bad. By definition, across all forms of evaluation. But there's lots of different levels of, there's lots of different purposes and lots of different levels of granularity when it comes to an assessment. So an indicator that's irresponsible for assessing an individual researcher for some kind of recognition or reward is perhaps less irresponsible when you're looking at it at country level or university level for perhaps understanding or monitoring progress. So there's a kind of just an understanding there that contexts can vary, and if I'll show you, there's a guide in a moment I can show you, and there's a grid where you can kind of think, well, okay, I'm looking to assess universities for allocation. How risky is this sort of activity? And the other context consideration, of course, is discipline, which will have a significant impact on how you assess. The O for scope is to look at all of your options for evaluating, so both qualitative and quantitative. We often reach for metrics because they're easy, but actually the rule of thumb that we usually use here is that if you're trying to assess something quantitative, you can use a quantitative indicator. So if you're looking at money or students or citations, you can count them. If you're looking at assessing quality or impact or value, then then those are qualitative things, and you'd be better off with some kind of qualitative indicator. The probe stage of scope is to then consider, once you've thought, well, actually, I think this is what we value, this is the context, these are the options we think might work, to probe those for things, unintended consequences, how it might be gamed, the cost benefit issue, and who might this discriminate against. So often, who is going to consistently win if we use this evaluation approach? And is that fair? So that's a kind of a scrutiny stage, really. And then the E of scope is to evaluate and then evaluate your evaluation. to ensure that it is actually working for you. Then the principles of scope, firstly, to evaluate only where you actually need to, because the sector is over evaluated. You know, do we actually need to evaluate in this space at all? And obviously the sorts of things that you're doing clearly do need to be done, but you know, what is the level of proportionality here? How proportionate is this assessment? The second is to evaluate with the evaluated, and this is the co-design thing, to build trust in the process, to make sure that you're evaluating with those communities that are being evaluated. So you design the evaluation with them, but you also implement the evaluation with them and assess the evaluation with them, so that there's kind of transparency and you know, you ensure you're getting a more meaningful evaluation. And the third is to draw on evaluation expertise, because there's so many evaluations in the research space, like university rankings, that are really just they lack validity and robustness. We just need to be a little bit more careful about, you know, the design of our evaluations. So that's basically it. And so I think it's not a method, but it is a kind of it is a framing that can help think through these evaluation problems and make sure that we're addressing all of the right things. So to come back to the question about team science, you know, it is something that we value. What will the consequences be of assessing it? It might be positive, might be negative. Well, how do we weight team science alongside all the other things that we care about? And is it team science itself, or is it what team science brings that we actually value? If that's not too philosophical an answer to your question.
That's very helpful. And I made a note that when we communicate the results of our work, I think it would be good to use scope framework, because it really helps to craft messages clearly. We also had a question about open science indicators, because we have to, like, our task is to integrate open science elements in this framework. And stepping away from REF, maybe with your research assess ahead, what would you do if you had such a task, or if you would, or maybe already thought about including some open science elements? How would you do that?
So I guess it depends, going back to scope, what is it that you value about open science? You know, and what are the dimensions of open science you care about? Is it just open access, or is it open data? Is it kind of open collaborations? Is it, you know, what is it? What are we talking about here? How are we defining it? For me, open science is a hygiene factor. It's not something that we want to issue gold stars for necessarily, but something that we should expect from our institutions. So I think the best way of assessing open science is to see it as a bit of a threshold indicator. So this is actually an approach that the REF took in 2021, in that all submissions were expected to that all of their outputs would be open access. Let's just clarify that. All journal articles and conference papers with an ISSN should be open access. And the threshold was 95%. So 95% of your outputs in that category had to be open access or have some legitimate exception, and the guidance for that is available. And any outputs that did not, you know, that hit that 95% were just not assessed. They got a 0 score. And I quite liked that. I mean, the approach was hugely complex for organisations, because you can imagine there's a huge number of exceptions, you know, and getting individual researchers to make sure their outputs were openly available, etc., was a massive piece of work. But it was hugely motivating. And, you know, really did, when you look at the UK's open access output relative to other parts of Europe, and it's significantly higher for that reason. You know, we had to make our outputs available. We couldn't risk not making our outputs available, and money was thrown at it as well. So I think that's the approach I would take for assessing openness, depending on how you're defining it. You know, to see it as a threshold, and you know, expect institutions to hit that threshold, rather than saying you're a 4-star open science, you're a 3-star open science, because that's, you know, ultimately we just want this to become business as usual, right? We want everything to be open. So, you know, and if that's the case, starting to award, you know, differentiate between 4-star and 3-star open science organizations is just not helpful, really.
Thanks a lot.
And how do you enforce open science requirements on humanities? So do they also have platforms for, let's say, maybe it's simplistic, but to my understanding, so to make like 100% of your outputs open science, you need either resources, just to make all publications open access and so on, or you need some platforms like Archive or other preprint platforms where with 0 resources or nearly 0 resources, you can just put your preprints on. So, and my understanding is that humanities often lack such platforms, and also the culture is a bit different, so that a lot of your output is in form of books. And so it's not usual to make them publicly. So what do you do, or what is the practice in those areas?
Yeah, so for REF 2021, the open access policy only applied to journal articles and conference papers with an ISSN. For funded research from UK Research and Innovation now, as of the 1st of January this month, the expectation is that if you've got funding from UK Research and Innovation to do research and you're producing a monograph, that monograph will need to be available openly, but they are allowing an embargo period for that. So I think it's a year in which you have to make it openly available, and funds are being made available. So they're throwing money at it, basically. Obviously, if there is no money available, the alternative is to expect outputs to be made available on preprint art service, or in accordance with publishers' green open access policies, or you introduce some kind of rights retention, which we've just introduced in the UK, largely. So, you know, we're expecting our researchers to retain the rights in their work so we can make them available in our repositories. So there's ways around it, as you're aware. With monographs, it's more difficult. So for the arts and humanities, but obviously for the last REF, for the arts and humanities, one, they didn't have many journal articles or conference papers, so it didn't apply to many. But 2, there was a legitimate exception that if the journal you think is the best place for your output is not open access, that's a legitimate exception. So obviously a lot of smaller arts and humanities journals, they're still in print, a lot of them. I mean, I had to actually get hold of some of these things and scan them and make them available to reviewers. But so yeah, so there were legitimate exceptions for the arts and humanities, basically. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Apologies, I'm taking notes as we speak to share with colleagues. We also have Olga Polotska, who is Director of National Research Foundation, joining us. And we scheduled 1 hour for this call, so we still have 6 minutes in case there are still any questions left. And thank you so much, Lizzie. That's really helpful.
No, it's a pleasure.
Really helps us to structure and also compare what we discussed with what you are saying, and I see a lot of similarities in our approach. Alexander, please.
Probably this could be like a nice final question, if I may. So, Lizzie, okay, let's imagine like a hypothetical situation that REF is super limited in resources. and you would like to select probably like one or like very small number of like one or two, let's say, indicators which you think can be assessed, could be assessed, and they are most valuable. What would you choose? I understand that that's very theoretical thing, but that's something we more or less have in Ukraine. So what in your opinion is the like very essential thing to such assessment?
I often get asked this sort of question, and I'm afraid that I swerve it because you know, because I would point you back to the scope framework. You tell me what it is you value about research and the research endeavour, and then you need to think about what options you might have for evidencing that, and are those things quantifiable, or are they qualities that should be assessed in a qualitative way. So I think even if you have little resource, you should still kind of go through that process to make sure that you're not ending up with you know, a bunch of indicators that really aren't the things that you care about. You know, if you have very little resource, you know, it might be that you have to really hone in on what is it actually that you value as a nation about your research activity and endeavour. What is it that you want to what is it that you want? Well, if this is funding, so you need to identify your context, but if this is about allocation of funding to those institutions, you know, what are you looking for in those institutions that you want to reward, essentially? And is it outputs, or is it team science? Is it open science? Is it you know, collaboration externally? You know, what is it that you're really looking to achieve as a nation? And then, you know, hone in on those. If you've got very little resource, hone in on those top five things that you really care about, and then provide some kind of indicators across those 5 things. I think it can be done responsibly even with little resource, if you're very clear that this is that these are indicators. They're not defining high quality institutions, and I think the comms around that would be really important. If you've only got, you know, 5 or 10 things that you're assessing, to kind of say, we are not saying that this institution is the best institution in the country, but this institution is kind of hitting the things that we care about in these dimensions, and therefore is going to be, you know, get greater investment to kind of do more of that stuff. So, and then you need to kind of do that important probe stage and think, you know, if we continue to do this, who's going to win, who's going to lose, what are the long-term impacts going to be, and what's it going to cost us, what benefits are going to accrue. So that piece of thinking is free, right? Just takes a bit of time, but it can be done, I think. But I wouldn't, yeah, it depends on you and your own missions and plans as a nation, what you're seeking, how you're seeking to characterize and grow your research sector, essentially.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. I hope it was useful.
Very useful. Thank you.
Great. Good luck with it, and you know where I am if you need me.